My name is Lucia T. Hosier, and I am 31 years old. At my brother's engagement party, he raised his glass and said, "To family, and to those who finally learn how to be quiet and useful." Everyone laughed. I smiled, lifted my glass, and said, "To quiet usefulness, and to the $8,000 venue deposit I just canceled." The music cut mid-song. His fiancée choked on her drink. Someone whispered, "Wait, what did she say?" I took a sip and realized I was finished paying to be taken seriously. Not serious in the way people usually mean. Not respected or admired or trusted. I mean the kind of serious that only shows up when you have money, when compliments come with conditions, when help is expected and gratitude is optional. That was the game my family had perfected, and for a long time I played it because I could. I'm a software engineer, stable job, no kids, no major debt. Saying yes was easy. A few hundred here, 1,000 there, a new fridge for my parents, dental work for my brother, emergency money for my mom. It added up quietly, the way resentment does. No one ever asked how I was doing. They only asked how I could help. Brian's engagement party was supposed to be the final yes. $8,000 for the vineyard, more for everything else. I'd already transferred money to my parents twice that month, and not once did anyone say thank you without wrapping it in a reminder of how lucky I was to be useful. I arrived at the venue already done. Not angry, done. I knew they'd parade me, drop my job title to the bride's family, imply Brian's success somehow leaned on mine. I was used to that. I wasn't used to the toast. Brian stood like he'd won an award, waited for the room to hush, then said it. The laughter felt like glass, shattering slowly. I caught my mom smirking, my dad nodding, Rachel leaning into Brian like it was charming. That was the moment I stopped negotiating. I stood, smiled, and told the truth. The party stopped breathing. My mom jumped up first, asking what I thought I was doing. My dad accused me of sabotaging Brian's life. Rachel's parents looked like they'd walked into the wrong room. Then Uncle Rick's voice cut through everything. "He warned you. I told you Lucia isn't your piggy bank." Silence followed him like a verdict. Rick was the only one who never asked me for a thing. He walked over and asked if I was ready to leave. I was. The calls started early the next morning. Missed calls stacked like invoices, messages that sounded like boardroom memos dressed as concern. None began with, "I'm sorry." My mom wrote paragraphs about responsibility and example. Brian texted, "Really, Lucia? You couldn't talk to me first." Rachel's father sent an email titled, "Your behavior at the engagement party, professional outrage wrapped in polite threats." He expected reimbursement for the photographer. He ended with consequences. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't know I'd decided to return them. The only person I answered was Rick. He called that night, calm as always, said he was proud of me, said he finally watched someone in this family do what the rest of us never had the nerve to do. Stop pretending these demands are normal. We talked briefly. No advice, no pressure to reconcile, just presence. It felt like breathing. The wedding planner called days later. No one told her the party was canceled. Brian and Rachel were pretending it was a misunderstanding. She asked if I wanted to continue. I said no, paid for her hours, and ended it. Clean. Then my dad showed up at my apartment unannounced. He didn't yell. He didn't sit. He said I owed my brother this. I asked why. He blinked, then said the truth. "Because you're the one who can." That's when it clicked. They never saw generosity. They saw assignment. I told him I was done and closed the door. That night, I found the SUV paperwork, paid in full, still in my name. I never transferred the title because I thought it didn't matter. It mattered now. I wasn't reclaiming a car. I was reclaiming the lie that access was permanent. I gave them 4 days of silence. On the 5th, Brian texted, "Fine, you've made your point. Can we move on now?" No apology, just a request to reset the machine. I called my insurance company and reassigned the SUV. By morning, I was at my parents' house with a tow truck. My mom called me cruel. I signed the release and watched the truck pull away. I didn't feel proud or angry. I felt light. That night, the group texts exploded. Accusations, minimizations. Brian complained about losses. My dad stayed silent. Rachel sent one honest message. "We didn't realize how much you were doing until you stopped. It didn't fix anything. It told the truth." Rick said something had started that couldn't be undone. He sounded relieved. Entitlement, he said, hates daylight. By the end of the week, Rachel's dad emailed again with a spreadsheet. Rick replied for me. Tell him to sue. Then a check arrived. $8,000. A note. Be the bigger person. Fix this. I mailed it back without a word. I wasn't buying blame. I wasn't renting peace. By then, I knew it wasn't over. When the money stops, people show you what they valued, and I was ready to see it. The morning after the party, my phone buzzed like it was trying to crawl off the nightstand. 11 missed calls from my mom, 4 from my dad, 2 from Brian, and a string of messages that read like a performance review written by people who thought they still managed me. Not one started with an apology. Not one asked how I was. They opened with urgency and ended with obligation, the same way they always did. My mom's first message was 3 paragraphs long. She said we needed to talk about what happened, that I couldn't just walk away from family when things didn't go my way, and that everyone counted on me. She said I had a responsibility to set an example. I read it twice, not because it was convincing, but because it finally named what I'd been to them all along. An example. A tool. A dependable lever to keep their machine running. Brian's text came later and shorter. Really, Lucia, you couldn't just talk to me first? No punctuation, no reflection, just confusion that I hadn't followed the script. He made a toast at my expense and then acted surprised when I didn't smile through it. I deleted the message without replying. Rachel's father sent an email with a subject line that sounded like a disciplinary hearing. I didn't open it right away. When I did, it was exactly what I expected. Professional outrage wrapped in polite threats, disappointment carefully measured, a reminder that actions have consequences. He expected reimbursement for the photographer they flew in. He wrote like a man who assumed invoices always got paid. He wasn't wrong about consequences. He was wrong about who owed them. I went to work, kept my head down, answered tickets, wrote code, did the things that made my life mine. Around noon, the wedding planner called again. Apparently, no one had told her the engagement party was canceled. Brian and Rachel were still pretending it was a misunderstanding. She asked if I wanted her to continue planning. I said no, told her she'd be paid for the hours she already worked, and ended the call. Clean lines, no drama. That evening, Uncle Rick called. Same tone as always, calm and steady, like he was checking in after a long week. He didn't ask me to explain. He said he was proud of me. Said he got into it with Aunt Diane because she thought he was enabling me. He told her he was finally watching someone in this family stop pretending these demands were normal. Hearing that felt like oxygen. The quiet didn't last. A few days later, my dad showed up at my apartment unannounced. I don't know how he got in, probably slipped through the building door behind someone else. I almost didn't open it, but I knew if I didn't, he'd keep coming. He didn't yell. He didn't sit. He stood in the entryway like I'd grown horns and said I owed my brother this. I asked why. He blinked, like the question wasn't on his list. Then he said it. Because you're the one who can. That was it. The truth in one sentence. They never thought I was generous. They thought it was my job to pay because I could and because they couldn't. I told him I was done paying to be invited, done covering for people who treated help like a guarantee instead of a gift. Before he could say anything else, I closed the door and locked it. That night, I pulled out the paperwork for the black SUV I'd bought for my parents 3 years earlier when my dad's old car died. Paid in full, registered in my name. I never transferred the title because I didn't think it mattered. It mattered now. If I was done being their fallback plan, I had to start reclaiming the things they treated like entitlements. I gave them 4 days. No responses, no explanations, no performances. On the 5th day, Brian texted again. Fine, you've made your point. Can we move on now? No apology, no responsibility, just a request to reset the machine. That afternoon, I called my insurance company and reassigned the SUV back under my policy. I gave them a different address, a storage facility not far from me where I'd already arranged a covered space. The next morning, I was at my parents' house with a spare key and a tow truck. My mom answered the door in her robe. My dad wasn't home. I told her I was taking the car. She said that was ridiculous, that I couldn't take something I'd gifted. I reminded her it was still in my name, that I paid the insurance, and that I was done giving things to people who thought they were entitled to them. She called me cruel. She said I was embarrassing the family. I signed the release and watched the tow truck pull out of their driveway with the SUV behind it. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel angry. I felt clean, like something heavy had finally been peeled off my back. That night, the group texts exploded. Accusations, minimizations, insults, disguised as jokes. Brian complained about being out of venue and a photographer. My dad stayed silent, which I heard was fury. The only message that didn't make me roll my eyes came from Rachel. It was short. "We didn't realize how much you were doing until you stopped. That's on us." It didn't fix anything, but it told the truth. And I knew then that when the money stops, the real story finally starts. The days after the car disappeared felt louder without any actual noise. My phone stayed mostly quiet, but the tension hung in the air like humidity before a storm. I went to work, cooked for myself, slept without checking messages, and let the silence do its job. It showed me something I hadn't wanted to admit before. I didn't miss them. I missed the version of myself who thought loyalty meant endurance. The first real escalation came disguised as politeness. Rachel's father emailed again, this time with numbers, a spreadsheet attached, neatly formatted, projecting losses from the canceled party. Photographer fees, venue penalties, emotional damage implied but not listed. He wrote that he was willing to resolve things amicably if I reimbursed a portion. The word amicably sat there like a threat wearing a smile. I forwarded the email to Rick. He replied with 4 words. "Tell him to sue." I didn't respond. 2 days later, a thick envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address. My name written in stiff block letters. Inside was a personal check for $8,000 and a scrap of notebook paper with 6 words. "Be the bigger person. Fix this." I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide what kind of trap it was. If I cashed it, I'd be accepting blame. I'd be confirming their story that I caused the mess. So I mailed it back the next morning without a note. No explanation, no apology, just the truth in action. That weekend, Rick called to tell me the family met without me. He said it was the most passive-aggressive disaster he'd seen in years. My parents were furious. Brian talked about eloping just to move past the drama. Rachel cried most of the time, apparently unsure if she wanted to marry into a family where every conversation eventually turned into a financial negotiation. Hearing that, I felt something shift. For the first time, I saw Rachel not as an accessory to my brother's life, but as someone trapped in the same performance I'd just walked away from. The real twist came the following Monday. An unknown number flashed on my screen. I almost didn't answer. Something told me to. It was Rachel. Her voice was quiet, unsteady, not the kind of crying meant to persuade. She said she needed to talk to someone who wasn't trying to control the outcome. She said she'd found something and didn't know what to do with it. She told me Brian had opened a joint account using her name, one she never authorized. He'd been shuffling money through it for wedding expenses and a short-term loan he never told her about. The $8,000 I canceled had been part of a fragile budget built on borrowed time and borrowed names. If she hadn't caught it early, she would have been legally tied to everything. I listened. I didn't say I told you so. I told her she deserved someone who didn't treat love like a line item on a spreadsheet. She thanked me and hung up. That was the moment I understood it wasn't just me they'd been using. Brian had turned the engagement into another performance for the family, and Rachel was just another prop. The pattern was bigger than I thought, and I wanted no part of it. By then, I'd blocked most of my family everywhere. Calls, texts, social media, even email. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. My work phone rang during lunch one afternoon. When I answered, it was my mother. She'd called my office and convinced someone to hand over the number. She launched straight into accusations. I was tearing the family apart. "I didn't care what Brian did," she said. "I should have handled it like an adult." I said one thing. "You gave them my work number. That's harassment." She went quiet, then muttered something about desperate times. I hung up, blocked the number, and reported the incident to HR to protect myself. That night, Rick showed up at my place with a six-pack and a tired look. He said Aunt Diane accused him of choosing sides and packed a bag. He didn't argue. He just left. He told me my dad had contacted a lawyer about forcing me to repay damages. It went nowhere, but the attempt said enough. They'd rather try to punish me than admit I owed them nothing, and that told me exactly what I needed to do next. The next morning, I made it final in writing. Not dramatic, not emotional, just clear. I wrote a short letter to each of them, my parents and Brian included, stating that I would no longer provide financial support of any kind. Not for events, not for emergencies, not for future plans. I said I had already done more than I needed to, and that they should stop contacting me. I sent the letter certified, not because I wanted proof of receipt, but because I wanted there to be no ambiguity left to hide behind. Then I booked a flight, somewhere far, humid, quiet, no return date, no itinerary I needed to explain. I didn't even tell Rick where I was going. I handed him a spare key to my apartment, asked him to check my mail once in a while, and said I needed to disappear for a bit. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He just nodded and slipped a folded note into my hand, telling me to read it when I landed. I left the next day with one carry-on and no plan beyond distance. I turned my phone off before boarding. On the plane, I opened Rick's note. It was one sentence. There's freedom in letting people hate you if it means you finally like yourself. I folded it back up and put it in my wallet. The first week away felt wrong in a way I hadn't expected. I woke up reaching for a phone that wasn't buzzing. I checked messages that weren't there. I waited for the familiar punch of guilt to arrive. It didn't. By the second week, the quiet stopped feeling staged and started feeling earned. I rented a scooter, took roads I couldn't pronounce, ate when I was hungry, slept when I was tired. For the first time in years, I wasn't managing anyone else's expectations. By the end of the month, I realized I hadn't thought about my parents or Brian in days. Not out of effort, out of absence. I called Rick from a beachside cafe with spotty reception, told him vaguely where I was and that I wasn't coming back anytime soon. He told me I didn't owe anyone a return ticket. He also told me what had finally cracked back home. Rachel called off the engagement. After discovering the unauthorized account, she started digging. She found purchases Brian had hidden, debts he'd rolled forward, excuses he'd rehearsed. When she confronted him, he blamed her and then blamed me for bailing. She packed up the next day and left town. Rick said my parents tried to pull her family back into the fold, but they were done. Apparently, Rachel's father never cashed the check he'd sent me and was now threatening to forward it to Brian with a legal notice attached. Rick sounded tired, but relieved. He said they were finally running out of people to point fingers at. I asked if he was okay. He said Aunt Diane still wasn't speaking to him, accused him of encouraging my ego. He didn't sound bitter. He sounded calm, like someone who'd already chosen peace over approval. I stayed longer than I planned. Maybe I'll stay longer still. All I know is I didn't look back. I didn't check their profiles. I didn't wonder what story they were telling now. The only person I stayed in touch with was Rick, and that was enough. When I finally came back after a little over 2 months, it wasn't because anything had changed back home. It was because I woke up one morning, looked out at the water, and knew I was ready to go home for me. The city looked the same. My apartment was still mine. No one was waiting. No messages slid in to greet me. The silence felt like confirmation. Rick found out I was back because my phone auto-connected to the smart lock he helped me install. He showed up that night with takeout, sat down like nothing had happened, and told me Aunt Diane filed for separation. He said my parents were still furious. Brian had moved back in with them, jobless and broke, and Rachel had moved to Portland. He said she thanked him for not lying to her. That mattered. I started therapy, picked up freelance work, slept better, ate at my table instead of my desk. I stopped answering calls I didn't want to take. I stopped paying for anyone's mess but my own. I used to think cutting off family was the last resort. Now I know it's sometimes the beginning. I didn't announce my return. I didn't post anything. I didn't text anyone to let them know I was back in the city. I spent the first few days walking around like a visitor in my own life, noticing how much quieter everything felt when I wasn't carrying other people's expectations. My apartment was exactly how I left it. Clean, spare, mine. There were no notes slipped under the door, no dramatic messages waiting to be read. The absence was telling. It meant they'd moved on to other narratives, other explanations that didn't require me. Work eased into a new rhythm. I stepped back from full-time without asking permission from anyone who didn't pay me. I took freelance contracts that interested me and declined the ones that didn't. I started cooking again, simple meals, eating at the table instead of in front of a screen, realizing how much of my life I'd spent rushing so I could be available for emergencies that weren't mine. Therapy started as something practical, once a week, No grand goals. I told my therapist I didn't want to reconcile with my family. I just wanted to stop feeling guilty for choosing myself. She said guilt is often the scar tissue left behind when boundaries finally form. That stayed with me. Rick came by a few nights later with takeout and the same tired smile. He said my parents hadn't reached out. Not to apologize, not to threaten, just silence. Brian was still living with them, jobless, somehow still the victim in every version of the story they told themselves. Rick said my dad kept saying this would all blow over if I'd just come back to my senses, as if senses were something you lost when you stopped paying. Rachel was gone for good. She moved to Portland, started over, and didn't look back. She sent Rick a message thanking him for not lying to her when it would have been easier. I didn't need to hear more than that. It confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't the problem. I was just the first person who stopped absorbing it. Weeks passed. I didn't hear from Aunt Diane. I didn't hear from cousins who once had opinions about everything I did. I stopped checking. That was the real change. Not blocking, not avoiding, just not caring enough to look. I realized how much of my energy had gone into anticipating reactions, bracing for comments, managing fallout. Without that, my days stretched open in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. One afternoon, I found an old spreadsheet on my laptop. Years of transfers, notes, reminders. I didn't delete it right away. I scrolled through it once, slowly, and then closed it without saving. I wasn't erasing the past. I was closing the account. Rick told me Diane officially filed for separation. She said he'd changed and meant it like an accusation. He said maybe he had. He said he stopped apologizing for not wanting to be used. He sounded lighter than I'd ever heard him. It made me realize that my choice didn't just free me. It cracked something open for someone else, too. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. I stopped waiting for closure that would never come in the form I once imagined. Some families don't apologize. They just lose access. And sometimes that's the most honest ending you get.